Welcome to the McElhaney Report. I'm Bill McElhaney. Each show we cover a crucial issue of the day, but always from a viewpoint or perspective rarely, if ever, aired by the mass media. We hope you'll find it interesting. This is perhaps the most important interview we've ever conducted. Since 1989, we've been told constantly by the mass media and the government about the so-called death of communism and the collapse of the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite nations. We are told that the new Russian rulers are democratic and opening up to political and economic freedom. The Bush and Clinton administrations have proposed even greater aid from U.S. taxpayers to the rulers of what is called the new Russia and the new Eastern European states. They tell us that we must aid and be partners with these rulers and join with them in a new world order. Our guest today can refute this conventional wisdom. He is one of two outstanding experts in the free world on this subject. The other expert, Anatoliy Golitsyn, the source of this information, has been living in the United States in hiding under an assumed identity since 1960 to protect himself from murder by the Soviet KGB. Our guest today is editor of the London-based periodical Soviet Analyst and editor of Golitsyn's second book, just published in the spring of 1995, The Perestroika Deception. I want to welcome Christopher Story to the McElhaney Report.
Delighted to be here.
Very happy to have you, sir. For our listeners who are unfamiliar with this subject, we must start at the beginning. Anatoly Golitsyn, this is one of maybe one or two existing public photographs of him, probably taken 30 years ago. Who is Anatoly Golitsyn, and what did he reveal when he defected from the Soviet KGB in 1960?
Golitsyn is the most important defector ever to have reached the West. He came out actually in 1961. He fled to Finland in 1961 with his family, and he revealed the existence of a long-range strategy of deception based on Leninist principles. And his importance is that all defectors who've come since him appear to have been engaged in an attempt to refute what he says. So we look to Golitsyn as the source of proper insights into what the communists are really up to.
And he predicted, did he not, that the KGB would send false defectors deliberately to discredit him?
That's correct, and this happened almost immediately afterwards. Within 6 months, several defectors,
now,
both from the KGB and from the military intelligence.
In addition to identifying Soviet moles in European and in the European intelligence system, British intelligence system, French, he provided this whole new understanding of Soviet disinformation strategy. There was one man in the CIA who listened to him seriously. That was James Angleton. Tell us about Angleton.
James Jesus Angleton was a very remarkable counterintelligence expert, and he debriefed Golitsyn, and he became absolutely convinced that Golitsyn was telling the truth. This is clear from internal evidence, but Angleton became aware through Golitsyn of the significance of what the Soviets were really up to. Basically, what Golitsyn taught and revealed was that all Soviet governments are Leninist governments. They're driven by the deception strategy perfected by Lenin, which is aimed at achieving a long-range strategy, namely control of the whole world.
And part of this strategy, as really put into a codified plan by 1959, dealt with creating the impression that liberalization or destabilization, decentralization was occurring in the communist states as a way of lulling the West into putting down its defenses.
Yeah. What happened was that, according to Golitsyn, is that after the death of Stalin, the communists realized, in general, that the method of control that they'd been adopting, namely brutal repression, was an inefficient method of achieving control over populations, and that it was more efficient to seek to achieve control through infiltration and deception, and through the control of the minds of the target. And so the party instructed Alexander Shelepin, who was the head of the KGB, in 1958 to develop a plan for the use of the total resources of the revolution. And the KGB and the GRU, military intelligence, were instructed to become the instruments of the mobilization of the resources of the revolution. So between 1959 and 1961, Shelepin developed, perfected, and agreed with the party the full outline of this deception plan. And the deception plan is basically a means of projecting communism into the whole of the rest of the world. And they do it through deception, and we can examine how this is done as we go on.
Well, one of the features of the plan, obviously, was to give the impression that the international communist movement was breaking up, that there were splits, divisions, dissent, that there was a rift between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, there was a rift between Red China and the Soviet Union. All of these things were examples of this disinformation strategy. And one of the principal goals of it would be that the West would feel more secure and put down its guard.
Yes. Lenin's methodology involves the use of the dialectic. Now, the Western mind, which is a civilized, developed mind, does not understand dialectical deception, which is basically a Mongol concept. And the fake Russia-China split is a good example. By creating the false impression that there was a split, which incidentally they've continued ever since, because now we have communist China and supposedly non-communist Russia, so the illusion of the split continues.
That's right.
The West was lulled into believing that if it supported China, it would be taking precautionary action against Russia.
Yes.
In fact, what's happening, and is continuing, they are both working together.
Yes.
And their intentions ultimately are hostile. They are aggressively oriented towards the West.
Yes, and another consequence of staging, deliberately staging, phony encouragement of, or setting up, let's say, setting up phony, the KGB setting up phony dissident movements within communist countries, and supposedly, or in a theatrical way, presenting what appears to be liberalization or some lessening of tight control. That also has the effect of lulling the underground, the genuine underground opposition to communism in these countries out in the open, giving them the false hope that they can speak out, and then further identifying them and destroying them.
Well, this goes back actually to Tsarist days. In fact, the Tsarist secret police were adept at this. But Stalin's henchman, the founder of the Cheka, Dzerzhinsky, was particularly skilled at using what we call false opposition. And in fact, this was the main thrust of Lenin's strategy in the 1920s. When Lenin launched into the West what is known as the Trust, he allowed the emigration of a large number of emigres, and in their number were many controlled communist members of the Cheka. And he introduced this false controlled opposition to Western intelligence, and as a result, the perception of by Western intelligence of what was really happening was distorted. Now, this principle has been applied since 1961, and it came to its fruition under Gorbachev. Gorbachev's Perestroika, which means restructuring, is in fact the restructuring not of Soviet society, although that was done for, there was a certain amount of reform and restructuring to give it credibility.
Superficial.
Superficial. It is essentially the restructuring of the Western mind, the control of the Western mind. That is what it means. Stalin used the word perestroika, and it meant, in Stalin's vocabulary, it meant the reshoeing of a horse. So the West misunderstood Perestroika, the meaning of Perestroika, thinking that it meant reform of the communist movement.
And this is
in fact, it's a deception.
Yes, and this is because everything that we've witnessed since 1989 has been part of this grand disinformation strategy, which Golitsyn revealed in his 1984 book, New Lies for Old, had been prepared by 1959.
Yes. The long-range strategy is what it says. It's a long-range strategy. It took years to come to fruition. There are a number of reasons for this. They had to allow, for example, those with memories of the Stalin repressions to die off. They had to ensure that the true opposition no longer existed, and they have liquidated all true opposition in all East European countries.
Which means,
with a few exceptions.
Which means, as Golitsyn has pointed out, then that and those deceptions are subject to question. Those exceptions are subject to question.
Yes, even those deceptions.
But when we see a supposed dissident movement within a communist or so-called former communist state, having access to the media, operating openly, having resources, and being able to express itself and be heard around the world, it would immediately be suspect of being a KGB front operation, at least in terms of its leadership.
Absolutely correct.
Yes.
And as a result of what Gorbachev first of all launches Perestroika internally, and when the softening up process has been completed, i.e. the West is attuned to the fact that there's been this apparent reform and that it's all falling apart, they then export Perestroika to the whole world.
Yes.
So that in fact what has happened is that you have, instead of having walk-ins, defectors arriving and knocking on the West door, you've got a mass walk-in, so that no one knows who's genuine and who isn't.
To go back just a bit regarding Golitsyn defecting to the American CIA in the early 1960s, he had an advocate in James Angleton, and the influence of what Golitsyn revealed was felt through Angleton's policies.
Yes.
But that came to an end in 1974 when Angleton was fired by CIA Director William Colby after Golitsyn had warned that there were Soviet moles, Soviet agents within the CIA at high levels. To what extent was Golitsyn vindicated by the Aldrich Ames exposure?
Totally.
Yes.
I mean, Golitsyn has been telling everybody since he finished the first book, New Lies for Old, which actually he finished in 1980, although it was only published in 1984, that the CIA was penetrated. This was obvious from internal evidence. Now, of course, with the Ames case, that is proved. I mean, everybody knows that there are many more moles inside Western intelligence than just Ames, but Ames is a symptom of the penetration of the Central Intelligence Agency.
In the book, as you said, written in 1980, published in 1984, Golitsyn's New Lies for Old, he revealed not only this massive disinformation strategy, which goes back to 1959, and the ramifications of it, the applications of it during the 1960s, 1970s, but he made a series, the book was published in '84, he made a series of incredible predictions regarding what was going to come as a result of this strategy, and the predictions are just amazing to read. Would you go over some of them?
Well, I mean, there are 3 or 4 pages which are just chock-a-block full of predictions. He talks about the removal of the Berlin Wall, liberalization starting in East Germany and spreading to the rest of Eastern Europe. He says, for example, that Dubček will be restored in Czechoslovakia, which duly happened for a brief period. And he talks about a reconciliation with the West and the reunification of Germany and so on and so forth. And in a recent book published by written by Mark Riebling, called Wedge, The Secret War Between the FBI and CIA, published in 1994, Riebling carries out a careful analysis of Golitsyn's predictions in New Lies for Old, and he established that out of 148 falsifiable predictions, 139 had been verified by 1993. Now that, and he gave him an accuracy rating of over 94%. That is without parallel in the West. I mean, this puts Golitsyn in a separate category from everybody. Now, I think...
In other words, if Golitsyn is not telling, is not telling the truth about...
Everybody has to explain why these predictions were correct.
If he's not telling the truth about the fact that all that we have witnessed since 1989 was planned as Soviet disinformation strategy going back this far, then he has to be a prophet. He has to be a clairvoyant.
Either he has to be... he has to have supernatural powers.
He has to have supernatural powers.
Or he has to understand Soviet strategy.
That's right.
And of course the answer is the latter.
Yes.
He understands Soviet strategy because he knows that it's based on the thinking of Lenin. He studied Lenin. Now, one of the things that I've done in the last few years is go back to Lenin and try to read and understand what this evil man is saying. He's actually preaching hatred. He's preaching how to deceive, and he's teaching us how to deceive. And Lenin's disciples remain in control of the world communist movement. All they've done is relabeled themselves in order to appear acceptable to the West. There's a passage in Lenin where he says that there may come a time in the revolution when true revolutionaries must put on the appearance and the clothing and the manner and the language of the enemy. And this is what they've done. So that... And it's very easy to see that this is the case once one understands that this is what's going on. If you take someone like Andrei Kozyrev, the Russian foreign minister, you can see that everything he says is a deception. He is an absolute, he's the most brilliant representative of the Leninist case currently operating. He's the son, incidentally, of one of the Soviet diplomats who were kicked out of London by the Douglas Hume government in 1972.
There is a description in New Lies for Old of a new liberal or more democratic figure who would emerge as the leader of the Soviet Union that is a mirror image of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yes.
Now tell us about Mikhail Gorbachev and perhaps his apparently more credible, at least in the eyes of the world and the media, successor Boris Yeltsin. Did they ever show any trace of interest in democratic reform?
Well, what they did show an interest in was in the continuation of their Leninist strategy.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
the important point about Gorbachev is that, as in the case of Hitler and Mein Kampf, he clearly and repeatedly laid down in black and white, in speeches and in his book Perestroika, what he was doing. He made it quite clear what he was doing. In Perestroika, he said, we went back to Lenin, we reviewed Lenin, we took inspiration from Lenin, and we based our strategy on Lenin. So when I was asked by Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was, to see her in the House of Commons in July 1991 to explain these matters to her, I was completely flabbergasted when she said to me, I don't think Gorbachev is a Leninist anymore. And then she also said, I don't think we've been deceived. At least I hope we haven't. So I was, in fact, that was the real turning point in the later part of my life. That was when I realized I should spend basically most of my time trying to explain how she was conned. And how wrong she was. Of course, it's very simple to do. You can show from Gorbachev's speeches, from his writings, that in fact he was constantly quoting Lenin. He is and was a key advocate of the Leninist world revolution. And of course, he remains so to this day. Gorbachev, as you probably know, is in charge of the so-called Gorbachev Foundation, which various experts led by Hans Graf Huhn, a well-known German expert, have identified as, in fact, the international department of the CPSU. And it's based here in San Francisco.
Communist Party, Soviet Union.
Yes.
Yes.
The international department of the CPSU was, in fact, the Comintern. So the Gorbachev Foundation, based in the Presidio in San Francisco, is, in fact, the Comintern. And what Gorbachev is in charge of is influencing the Western elite. And in fact, the key elite, of course, is based here. This is the elite that he has to influence, which is what he's been doing ever since he arrived with a large delegation in Washington in 1987.
That's right. And his opponent, or his political rival, or his the opposition, the quote-unquote opposition he faced, Boris Yeltsin, comes from the same Leninist background.
Oh, no question. I mean, Boris Yeltsin was awarded the Order of Lenin. He is a Communist Party chief. He could not possibly have risen to the level he did in the structures without being approved at the highest level. I mean, no one can move without approval.
Well, now, looking at the reality of what exists today in the light of the predictions Golitsyn made in New Lies for Old, we see that, as he predicted, the Soviet Union and its power and control over its republics, separate republics, and satellite nations still continues through the same KGB and leaden bureaucracies that have simply been given new names, but that are still in place, fully in place.
The so-called independence of the Soviet republics is false and provisional. It's based on Lenin's fake Far Eastern Republic, which he set up in the late 1920s. And the existence of these republics has been brought about for a number of strategic reasons. I mean, at a fairly low level, one of the most important reasons is that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and all the international institutions have been penetrated by all these countries. So instead of just having the USSR and Ukraine and Belarus up to 1990, we now have 16 of these republics. So that suddenly we've got 16 KGBs, and we've got 16 delegations in the World Bank and the IMF, so that these institutions have now have metamorphosed into instruments of the revolution more clearly than was the case before. That is one reason why they are provisionally they were given this curious independence. But another very important reason is that with the apparent independence of these countries, they opened up scope for independent military action, so that the repression which subsequently took place in Georgia, Tajikistan, Moldova, and in Abkhazia could take place. The minorities could be suppressed, and Russia could be whiter than white. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
In other words, the repression was carried out by apparent non-communists.
Was delegated to...
Was delegated.
Yes, right.
And it was actually in the case of Georgia where the most severe repression has been taking place, supervised by Shevardnadze, who the West thought was a Christian. Was not only a Christian, but baptized a Christian, but the architect of the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
He's known as Stalin II in Georgia.
Yes. All right, in the early 1980s, Abraham Shifrin of Israel, an expert on Soviet concentration camps, published a guidebook to these camps listing over 1,700 concentration camp sites in the Soviet Union with millions of prisoners. Are we to believe that all of these suddenly vanished in about 1989?
Are we to believe that these people suddenly, all of a sudden, set aside their ideology and suddenly started talking normally?
Or the some 60 million members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, did they all stop being members of it instantly at the same time?
Golitsyn makes it quite clear in his new book, The Perestroika Deception, that the power structures depend on the continued adherence to revolutionary objectives of the Komsomol. There are over 50 million members of Komsomol. They work closely with the structures. And so he says somewhere in the book, he says, scratch any of these so-called sudden instant Democrats, and you will find underneath them a Komsomol or a secret party member. So that all these people you see on the television screen in Moscow, they are all, without exception, secret party or Komsomol members.
We're going to have to do a second show on the content of Perestroika Deception because it covers the period of 1989 through 1993 and written by Golitsyn and actually derived from memoranda he prepared for the CIA, which they of course ignored. But we hear about free enterprise, a burgeoning of free enterprise in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern European countries. What is the reality of this? I mean, isn't it overwhelmingly controlled and limited in a way that makes a mockery of the term free enterprise?
They themselves call it state-controlled capitalism, which is, of course, a contradiction in terms. What has happened is that Lenin's original state was a criminal state. The Chekar, the Soviet intelligence controlled the mafia, invented the mafia, became the mafia. So that this apparent outbreak of free enterprise we see is in fact controlled by the KGB. And this outbreak of Soviet criminality is controlled,
yes.
And it's being exported on a global scale.
Right.
Why is it being exported? In order to, it's one of the themes that they are developing to create problems which need global solutions, so that there's a world crime epidemic, terrorist epidemic. We've got to have global structures in order to contain this epidemic which they themselves have created.
Also, the KGB-generated criminal activity provides an excuse for ever tighter control over whatever window dressing business or free enterprise or business or entrepreneurial activity may exist over there.
Sure, and not only that, but of course you've got the drug element as well. Since the 1950s, Soviet military intelligence, GRU, has been in control of drug networks all over the world. And the reason the GRU controls is involved in this is because it's sabotage. You know, the narcotics operation is sabotage. Other elements are controlled by the KGB.
Christopher, we're going to have to continue in our second part of this interview. I want to thank you for being with us today. If you found any of this information, as you should, interesting and disturbing, please contact us at the address or phone number given at the end of the program. We'll be happy to send you full documentation on any subject that we've discussed that may interest you. This is Bill McElhaney for the McElhaney Report, thanking you so much for joining us.